The billionaire married her without love, but one night his desire could not be controlled. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The worst decisions always come disguised as the only option. Ellery Dean stared at the stack of overdue bills spread across her cramped kitchen table, like tarot cards predicting financial doom. The red ink seemed to mock her as she counted, again, the meager balance in her checking account, $47.32. Not even enough to cover her medication refill, let alone the rent that was due 3 days ago. She pressed her palms against her temples, feeling the familiar tightness that signaled another anxiety attack brewing. The small studio apartment in Portland's least desirable neighborhood suddenly felt even smaller, the walls closing in with each shallow breath. Her laptop sat open beside the bills, displaying yet another rejection email from a potential client. "Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to go with someone with more experience." More experience. At 28, she had a portfolio that should have impressed anyone, but freelance graphic design in a saturated market was like trying to catch rain with a thimble. Everyone wanted premium work for bargain prices, and even then, they'd ghost you for weeks before deciding to go in a different direction. Ellery reached for the orange prescription bottle on the windowsill, shaking out her daily escitalopram. The little white pill had become as essential as coffee, her lifeline to functioning in a world that felt increasingly overwhelming. As she swallowed it dry, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but desperation made her answer. "Is this Ellery Dean?" The voice was crisp, professional, unmistakably expensive. "Yes, this is she. My name is Miranda Walsh. I represent a private client who's reviewed your portfolio and would like to schedule an interview. Are you available this afternoon?" Ellery's heart jumped. "An interview? For what position?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss details over the phone. The meeting is strictly confidential. Can you be at 2847 Cascade Boulevard at 3 o'clock? She glanced at the clock. It was already past noon. Yes, I can be there. Should I bring anything specific?" "Just yourself. And Miss Dean, please dress professionally. This is a very important opportunity." The line went dead before Ellery could ask any follow-up questions. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. Cascade Boulevard was in the upscale business district, not where she usually interviewed for small-time design gigs. This had to be something bigger. 30 minutes later, she stood in front of her closet, surveying her limited options. The black blazer had a small stain near the hem, but it was barely noticeable. She paired it with her only good pair of slacks and the heels that pinched her feet, but made her feel taller, more confident. The bus ride across town gave her time to rehearse potential interview questions, but her mind kept wandering to worst-case scenarios. What if this was some kind of scam? What if she was walking into something dangerous? But then she remembered the bills on her table, the empty refrigerator, the notice from her landlord threatening eviction. Sometimes desperation was the only courage you had left. The building at 2847 Cascade Boulevard was everything she'd expected, gleaming glass and steel that reflected the overcast Oregon sky. Inside, the lobby was all marble and minimalist furniture that probably cost more than her monthly rent. A security guard directed her to the 15th floor. The elevator ride felt endless. Her hands were shaking slightly. Whether from nerves or the caffeine crash from skipping lunch, she couldn't tell. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a reception area that looked like something out of a high-end magazine. "Ellery Dean?" A woman in her 50s approached, immaculately dressed in a way that screamed money and power. "I'm Miranda Walsh. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Of course, though I have to admit I'm curious about what kind of position this is for." Miranda's smile was perfectly polite and completely unreadable. "All will be explained shortly. Please follow me." They walked down a corridor lined with abstract art that probably cost more than Ellery's entire education. Miranda stopped in front of a heavy oak door and turned to face her. "Miss Dean, what I'm about to show you may seem unusual, but I want you to remember that sometimes the most extraordinary opportunities come in the most unexpected packages." Her hand reached for the door handle, and Ellery felt her world balance on the edge of something she couldn't yet name. And then Miranda opened the door. Some offers are too impossible to refuse, and too dangerous to accept. The first thing Ellery noticed wasn't the man sitting behind the massive mahogany desk, but the silence. It was the kind of profound quiet that money could buy. Soundproofed walls, thick carpets and the weight of power that made even breathing feel deliberate. Then she saw him. Cassian Holt didn't look up immediately when she entered. He was signing documents with the precision of a surgeon, each stroke of his pen calculated and final. Dark hair, perfectly styled but with just enough tousle to suggest he'd been running his hands through it. When he finally raised his eyes, Ellery felt the air shift in the room. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, but his eyes held decades of carefully guarded secrets. Steel gray, sharp enough to cut through pretense, and currently studying her like she was a business proposition he wasn't entirely sure about. Miss Dean. His voice matched everything else about him. Controlled, expensive, and completely unreadable. Please sit. Miranda gestured to one of the leather chairs facing the desk and quietly excused herself, leaving Ellery alone with a man who clearly owned more than she could ever dream of. The chair was butter-soft and probably cost more than her car. I imagine you're wondering why you're here, Cassian said, finally setting down his pen and giving her his full attention. The thought had crossed my mind. Ellery tried to match his professional tone, but her voice betrayed the slightest tremor. Your assistant mentioned reviewing my portfolio, but this doesn't exactly look like a typical design agency. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. No, it's not. I'm the CEO of Holt Digital Solutions. Perhaps you've heard of us. Ellery's breath caught. Of course she'd heard of them. Everyone in the tech world had. They were the company behind half the apps on her phone, worth billions, making headlines for acquisitions and innovations that shaped how people lived their digital lives. I'm familiar with your company's reputation, she managed. Good. Then you understand that what I'm about to propose requires absolute discretion. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. I have a problem, Miss Dean. A very public, very expensive problem that requires an unconventional solution. He pressed a button on his desk, and a wall-mounted screen flickered to life, displaying newspaper headlines and social media screenshots. The words blurred together. Scandal, betrayal, trust fund playboy, company stock plummets. 3 months ago, my ex-fiancé decided to share intimate details of our relationship with the press. Apparently, my dedication to work over romance makes for compelling tabloid fodder. His tone was matter-of-fact, but Ellery caught the tightness around his eyes. The board is questioning my judgment. Investors are nervous. My personal life has become a liability to everything I've built. I'm sorry, but I don't understand what this has to do with me. Cassian stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. Portland sprawled below them, tiny and manageable from this height. I need to rehabilitate my image, show the world that I'm capable of commitment, stability, the kind of personal growth that translates to business reliability. Okay. Ellery felt like she was missing crucial pieces of a puzzle. Are you looking for help with a PR campaign? Because I mainly do graphic design, not, I need a wife. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Ellery blinked, certain she'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? Cassian turned back to face her, his expression as calm as if he'd just commented on the weather. I need a wife. Someone intelligent, presentable, without a complicated past or hidden agendas. Someone who can play the role convincingly for 6 months while the media attention dies down and my company stabilizes. You want to hire an actress? I want to hire you. Ellery's mind went blank. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke, except nothing about Cassian Holt suggested he was the type to find humor in anything, let alone something this absurd. You're serious. Completely. It would be a legal marriage, properly documented, but purely business. A contract with clear terms, boundaries, and compensation. He returned to his desk and opened a leather folder, sliding a single sheet of paper across to her. The basic framework. Her eyes scanned the document and the numbers made her dizzy. More money than she'd ever seen. Enough to pay off every debt, start fresh, maybe even take the time to build her freelance business properly. This is insane, she whispered. This is business, he corrected. You need financial stability. I need personal credibility. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. But why me? You could hire any professional actress in Hollywood. Actresses have agents, publicists, careers to protect. They talk. He studied her again with those penetrating gray eyes. You're invisible. No social media presence. No connections to entertainment industry gossip. No reason for anyone to look too closely. You're perfect precisely because you're nobody. The words should have stung, but instead Ellery found them oddly liberating. Being nobody had always felt like a failure. Now it was apparently a qualification. 6 months, she said slowly. And then what? Divorce. Quiet, amicable, with a generous settlement that ensures your continued discretion. He paused. What do you say, Miss Dean? Ellery looked down at the contract, then at the man who could solve all her problems with a signature. Her rational mind screamed that this was crazy, dangerous, impossible, but her empty bank account whispered something else entirely. I'll do it, she heard herself say, and wondered if she'd just made the best decision of her life, or signed her own emotional death warrant. Marriage certificates don't come with warning labels. Maybe they should. The courthouse in downtown Portland felt nothing like the wedding venues Ellery had dreamed about as a little girl. No flowers, no music, no family crying happy tears in the front row. Just fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum floors, and the sound of rubber stamps marking the end of one life and the beginning of something she couldn't yet define. She sat in the waiting area, smoothing down her simple navy dress, the nicest thing she owned that wasn't stained or wrinkled beyond salvation. Cassian had given her a week to get her affairs in order, which mostly meant lying to her landlord about a sudden inheritance and avoiding calls from her sister in Sacramento, who would have talked her out of this insane decision. Miss Dean? A clerk appeared with a clipboard. We're ready for you. Her hands were trembling as she stood. This morning she'd woken up as Ellery Dean, struggling freelancer with an empty refrigerator and maxed-out credit cards. In 10 minutes, she'd be Mrs. Cassian Holt, wife to a billionaire, living in a world she'd only seen in magazines. Cassian was already waiting in the small ceremony room, flanked by 2 people she didn't recognize, witnesses he'd hired for the occasion, probably the same way someone might hire movers or caterers. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than her annual income, and when he saw her, he nodded once. Professional, businesslike, exactly what this was. You look appropriate, he said, and she wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a performance review. The officiant, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, began reading the standard vows with all the enthusiasm of someone reciting a grocery list. Ellery tried to focus on the words, but her mind kept wandering. What was she doing? This man was essentially a stranger. She knew his net worth, his business reputation, and the fact that he took his coffee black with no sugar, a detail Miranda had shared during their prep meeting. But she didn't know if he laughed at bad movies, or if he was afraid of spiders, or what he dreamed about at night. Do you, Cassian James Holt, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. No hesitation, no emotion, just another contract clause being acknowledged. And do you, Ellery May Dean, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? The words stuck in her throat for a moment. Through the small window she could see people walking by on the street, living their normal Thursday afternoon lives, completely unaware that someone inside was about to become a completely different person. I do. The ring Cassian slipped onto her finger was beautiful. A simple platinum band with a diamond that caught the harsh lighting and threw tiny rainbows across the wall. It fit perfectly, which shouldn't have surprised her since Miranda had somehow obtained her ring size during one of their meetings, but it did. Everything about this arrangement had been planned and measured and controlled, down to the last detail. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss. Cassian simply shook her hand, firm and brief, like they'd just closed a business deal, which Ellery supposed they had. The paperwork took longer than the ceremony. Signatures, stamps, witnessed attestations that yes, they were both entering this marriage willingly and of sound mind. Ellery wondered about that last part as she signed her new name for the first time. Ellery Dean Holt. The letters felt foreign under her pen. Congratulations, the clerk said with practiced cheer, handing them their official marriage certificate. Wishing you both a lifetime of happiness. Cassian tucked the document into his briefcase without looking at it. Thank you. That will be all. Outside the courthouse, a black sedan waited at the curb. Not a limousine, which would have been too conspicuous, but expensive enough to make a statement. The driver held the door open, and Ellery slid across leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent had been. Your belongings? Cassian asked, as the car pulled into traffic. Already moved. All 3 boxes of them, transported by a moving service he'd arranged. Her entire life fit in the back of a pickup truck. Thank you for handling that. Efficiency is important. He was looking out the window, watching the city blur past. Miranda has prepared a briefing folder for you. House rules, schedules, the basics of what you need to know about my routine and expectations. House rules. Like she was a house guest instead of his wife. Well, technically she was both, she supposed. What should I call you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. He turned to look at her, eyebrows slightly raised. What do you mean? I mean, in public we're married. Are we Cassian and Ellery? Mr. and Mrs. Holt? Do we use pet names? The last suggestion felt ridiculous even as she said it. Cassian is fine. A pause. Though in professional settings you should refer to me as your husband. It reinforces the narrative. The narrative. Right. This was all just a story they were telling with scripted lines and predetermined outcomes. She twisted the new ring around her finger, still getting used to its weight. The house? Mansion, really. Sat behind electronic gates in the West Hills. All clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed glimpses of minimalist perfection inside. As they pulled up the curved driveway, Ellery felt a flutter of panic. This was really happening. She was really going to live here in this perfect, intimidating space with this perfectly intimidating man. There's a separate entrance to your wing, Cassian said as they walked toward the front door. You'll have complete privacy. I typically work late and leave early, so we shouldn't disturb each other's routines unnecessarily. He made it sound like they were roommates with different schedules, not husband and wife, which, she reminded herself, was exactly what they were. Inside, the house was everything she'd expected. Beautiful, expensive, and utterly impersonal, like a high-end hotel where no one actually lived, just visited briefly between more important destinations. Your room is upstairs, second door on the left, Cassian said, already moving toward what looked like a home office. Miranda left dinner arrangements in your folder. If you need anything urgent, there's an intercom system. And then he was gone, disappearing behind a heavy door that closed with the soft, final sound of expensive engineering. Ellery stood alone in the marble foyer, her new wedding ring catching the light from a chandelier that probably cost more than her college tuition. 6 months suddenly felt like a very long time. The hardest part about pretending to be married isn't the acting. It's the silence between scenes. 3 weeks into her new life as Mrs. Holt, Ellery had developed a routine that perfectly avoided her husband. She woke at 7, made coffee in the pristine kitchen that looked like a showroom, and ate breakfast while reading the news on her tablet, a habit she'd picked up since moving into a world where stock prices and merger announcements apparently mattered. By the time she finished her second cup, Cassian's black Tesla would be pulling out of the driveway, leaving her alone in 15,000 square feet of elegant isolation. The house was beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. Every surface was spotless, every piece of furniture positioned with mathematical precision. The refrigerator was always perfectly stocked by a housekeeper named Dolores, who came twice a week and spoke to Ellery with the polite distance reserved for temporary residents. Even the towels in her bathroom were folded into perfect rectangles, as if waiting for a magazine photographer to arrive. Ellery had tried to make her bedroom feel more personal. A few books on the nightstand, her old laptop on the desk, a small plant she'd bought at the grocery store, but her belongings looked lost in the vast space, like drops of water in an empty swimming pool. The loneliness was the worst part. She'd thought living alone in her cramped studio had been isolating, but at least then she'd belonged to herself. Here she belonged to a contract, a performance, a story that everyone else seemed to understand better than she did. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Mackenzie. "How's the new job? You've been so mysterious about it. Call me." Ellery stared at the message, her thumbs hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain that her new job involved pretending to be happily married to a man who treated her like an employee he occasionally glimpsed in the hallway? She was saved from having to respond by the sound of Cassian's car returning. It was only 2 in the afternoon, much earlier than his usual 10 or 11 p.m. arrival. She heard his footsteps in the marble foyer, then his voice speaking to someone on the phone. "No, I understand the concerns, but the quarterly numbers speak for themselves. Yes, Martha will be there. Of course she'll be there." Ellery froze. Martha? Who was Martha? The conversation continued, but his voice moved toward the office and she couldn't make out the words. She found herself creeping closer to her bedroom door, straining to listen, then felt ridiculous for acting like a spy in her own temporary home. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door. "Ellery?" Cassian's voice was different, less commanding, more uncertain. "May I come in?" She opened the door to find him still in his business suit, but his tie was loosened, and his hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost human. "We need to talk," he said. "There's been a development." She gestured for him to sit in the small seating area by the window, but he remained standing, pacing slightly. "My board of directors is having their annual retreat next weekend, in Napa Valley. It's a tradition, very social, very couple-oriented. Okay. Ellery wasn't sure where this was heading, but the tension in his shoulders suggested it wasn't anywhere good. They're expecting to meet my wife. He paused. They're expecting to meet Martha. The name hit her like cold water. Who's Martha? You. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. We agreed you'd use a different name for public appearances. Martha Holt. It was in your briefing folder. Ellery's mind raced back to the stack of documents Miranda had given her. She'd read through most of them, but they'd been dense with legal language and corporate protocols. She must have missed that detail. I don't remember seeing that. Page 47. Miranda highlighted it. His jaw tightened. This is exactly the kind of oversight that could expose the arrangement. The criticism stung more than it should have. I'm sorry. I'll review everything again tonight. Something in her voice must have reached him because his expression softened slightly. It's not. The point is, we need to prepare. This isn't a casual dinner or a photo opportunity. These people have known me for years. They'll be watching us, evaluating every interaction. What does that mean exactly? Cassian sat down across from her and she noticed he looked tired, not just physically but in a deeper way, like someone carrying weight he couldn't put down. It means we need to learn how to act like we're in love, he said simply. Not just married, in love. The words settled between them like a challenge. Ellery had been playing the role of wife for 3 weeks, but it had been easy to maintain the illusion when their only interactions were polite nods in passing and the occasional discussion of household logistics. This was different. This required something she wasn't sure either of them was capable of. How do we do that, she asked. Practice. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those sharp gray eyes. We need to know each other's histories, preferences, habits, the kind of details couples share naturally. Like what? Like... He paused as if the concept of personal sharing was foreign to him. Like how you take your coffee, what you were studying before you became a designer, why you moved to Portland. The questions were so basic, so fundamental to who she was, that it felt strange he didn't already know the answers. But then again, she realized, she didn't know his either. I take my coffee with cream, no sugar, she said slowly. I studied journalism at the University of Oregon, but switched to graphic design when I couldn't find work at newspapers. And I moved to Portland because it was far enough from home to feel independent but close enough to visit my sister. Cassian nodded, as if filing away the information. I take mine black. I studied computer science at Stanford, and I've lived in Portland my entire life, except for college. It was the most personal conversation they'd had since their wedding day. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were sharing intimate details not because they wanted to know each other, but because they had to pretend they already did. What else do I need to know? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the perfectly manicured gardens. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost vulnerable. That this isn't easy for me either, he admitted. I'm not good at this. Personal relationships, the emotional components. It was the first crack she'd seen in his professional armor, and something inside her chest loosened slightly. Maybe we can figure it out together, she heard herself say. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the silence that followed didn't feel quite so empty. The most dangerous part of pretending to be in love is forgetting you're pretending. Your hand is cold. Cassian's fingers intertwined with hers as they practiced walking through the living room, their movements awkward and calculated like amateur dancers learning choreography. It was their 4th evening of what he called relationship rehearsals, sessions that felt more like business meetings than anything resembling romance. Sorry. Ellery tried to relax her grip, but everything about this felt unnatural. I'm nervous. You can't be nervous in Napa, he said, stopping their movement. These people will interpret nervousness as guilt or worse, incompetence. They'll assume I chose poorly. The criticism hit harder than it should have. Over the past week of practice sessions, she'd learned that Cassian approached affection the same way he approached everything else. Methodically, efficiently, with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. He'd made lists of things they needed to remember, how they met, a charity fundraiser, a safe fiction, their first date, dinner at Le Bernardin in New York, never mind that Ellery had never been east of Denver, even their supposed engagement story, a weekend in Big Sur, which he'd described with the enthusiasm of someone reading a quarterly report. Let's try the hand-holding again, she suggested, determined not to let his perfectionism intimidate her. But this time, maybe don't announce my temperature like it's a weather report. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Point taken. They started walking again, and this time when his fingers slipped between hers, she focused on the warmth of his palm, the slight callus on his thumb that suggested he did something with his hands besides sign contracts. It was easier to pretend when she concentrated on the small, human details. "Better," he said, and she felt an absurd flutter of pride at his approval. "Tell me something," she said as they reached the far end of the room and turned back. "Something that's not in the briefing folder. Such as? I don't know. What did you want to be when you were 10 years old?" Cassian was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. They completed another lap of the room before he spoke. "A pilot," he said finally. "I wanted to fly planes. Commercial or military?" "Neither. I wanted to fly small planes, take people on scenic tours, maybe do charter flights to remote places." He paused. "My father thought it was impractical, financially irresponsible." There was something in his voice, a carefully buried disappointment that made Ellery's chest tighten. "What changed your mind?" "I inherited a tech company when I turned 18. Hard to pursue aviation when you're busy keeping a $100 million business from collapsing." 18? Ellery stopped walking. "You've been running Holt Digital since you were 18? My father died in a car accident my senior year of high school. The board wanted to sell, but I convinced them to let me try." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Turns out I was better at business than I ever was at dreaming." The conversation felt too real, too intimate for their practiced performance. Ellery found herself studying his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way he looked straight ahead when talking about difficult things, as if meeting her eyes would make the memories too vivid. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your father. It was a long time ago." The dismissal was automatic, practiced, but his hand didn't let go of hers. They were interrupted by the soft chime of the doorbell. Cassian frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and unscheduled visitors were rare in his carefully controlled world. Dolores appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Holt? There's a woman here to see Mrs. Holt. Says she's her sister?" Ellery's blood turned to ice. "Mackenzie, here, now. I'll handle this," she said quickly, trying to pull her hand free, but Cassian held on. "No," he said quietly. "We handle this. Together. Remember? We're married." Through the front window, Ellery could see her sister's familiar silhouette pacing on the front porch. Mackenzie had always been impulsive, but showing up unannounced was extreme even for her. "She can't know," Ellery whispered urgently, "about the arrangement. She'll try to talk me out of it, or worse, she'll think I've lost my mind. Then we convince her you haven't." Cassian straightened his shoulders, slipping seamlessly into the role of devoted husband. "What's her name again?" "Mackenzie, Kenzie. She's protective, suspicious, and she knows me better than anyone." "Then let's give her a show worth believing." When Dolores opened the door, Mackenzie burst through like a force of nature, all wild curly hair and worried energy. She was smaller than Ellery, more compact, with their mother's determined chin and their father's stubborn streak. "Ellie, what the hell is going on? You disappear for a month, ignore my calls, and then I find out from Linda Kowalski, who heard it from her nephew who works downtown, that you got married." "Married, Ellie?" "Kenzie, I can explain." "To a billionaire, without telling your own sister." Mackenzie's eyes swept over the marble foyer, taking in the expensive art and perfect lighting. "Did you have some kind of breakdown? Are you being held against your will? Blink twice if you need me to call the police." Despite everything, Ellery almost smiled. This was so typically Mackenzie. Assume the worst-case scenario and prepare for battle. "Kenzie, I'd like you to meet my husband, Cassian Holt." "Cassian, this is my sister Mackenzie." Cassian stepped forward, and Ellery watched in fascination as he transformed. The rigid businessman melted away, replaced by someone warmer, more approachable. His smile looked genuine, his handshake firm, but friendly. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Mackenzie. Ellery talks about you constantly." Mackenzie's eyes narrowed. She was clearly trying to reconcile this polished, expensive man with her sister's previous dating history of struggling artists and unemployed musicians. Does she now? Because she's mentioned you exactly 0 times in the past 5 years. "We kept things private," Ellery said quickly. "You know how you get about my relationships. I get concerned when my sister dates men who borrow money for dinner dates." Mackenzie shot back. "This is different." Cassian's hand found Ellery's waist, pulling her gently against his side. The gesture looked natural, protective, loving. She marveled at how easily he could slip into the performance. "I know this must be surprising," he said to Mackenzie. "Ellery wanted to tell you sooner, but we were both worried about media attention. My company's been in the news lately and we wanted to protect our privacy as much as possible. It was a good explanation. Logical, reasonable, the kind of thing her practical sister might actually buy. But Mackenzie wasn't done interrogating. How did you meet? Ellery opened her mouth to recite their prepared story, but Cassian beat her to it. She spilled coffee on me, he said, smiling down at Ellery with what looked like genuine affection. At Pike Place Market. I was having the worst morning. Board meeting gone wrong. Impossible deadlines. And then this beautiful woman crashes into me and ruins my shirt. The story was different from their rehearsed version. More spontaneous. More human. Ellery found herself leaning into it. I was mortified, she added. He was wearing this expensive suit, and I had coffee dripping everywhere. I tried to apologize and clean it up, but I just made it worse. She bought me a new shirt, Cassian continued, from a tourist shop. It was bright blue and said I Heart Seattle across the front. You wore it? All day. To every meeting. His laugh sounded real, and for a moment Ellery almost believed their story herself. My assistant thought I'd had some kind of mental breakdown. Mackenzie was softening. Ellery could see it in the way her shoulders relaxed, the slight smile tugging at her lips. She'd always been a sucker for romantic meet-cutes. Okay, Mackenzie said finally, but I'm staying for dinner, and I want to hear everything. And I mean everything. Sometimes darkness reveals what daylight keeps hidden. The dinner with Mackenzie had gone better than expected. Cassian had been charming, attentive, playing the role of devoted husband with an expertise that both impressed and unsettled Ellery. Her sister had left 3 hours later, convinced that her formerly struggling sibling had somehow landed in a fairy tale romance. The lie had come so easily that Ellery found herself almost believing it too. Now, 2 days later, she was alone again. Cassian had flown to San Francisco for meetings, leaving her to rattle around the pristine house like a ghost haunting someone else's life. She'd spent the afternoon working on freelance projects. Old habits die hard, and the financial security of her arrangement hadn't quite sunk in enough for her to stop seeking backup plans. The October storm hit Portland without warning. One moment she was reviewing color palettes on her laptop. The next she was plunged into complete darkness as thunder crashed overhead and rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Emergency lighting kicked in automatically. Of course, Cassian's house had backup systems for everything, but it was dim, casting long shadows that made the familiar spaces feel foreign and intimate. She tried the main switches, but nothing happened. Even the backup generators seemed to be struggling against the storm's intensity. Her phone showed no signal. The cell towers must have been affected too. She was truly alone, in a house too big and too quiet, with nothing but the storm for company. That's when she heard the front door. Ellery's heart jumped. The security system should have prevented anyone from getting in, but maybe the power outage had disabled it. She crept toward the foyer, grateful for the soft emergency lighting that let her move without stumbling over furniture. Ellery? Cassian's voice cut through the darkness, rough with exhaustion and frustration. The garage door won't open. I had to park outside. Relief flooded through her. I'm here. The power's been out for about an hour. She found him in the entryway, dripping wet from the sprint between his car and the front door. His usually perfect hair was plastered against his forehead, and his expensive suit was soaked through. In the dim lighting, he looked younger, more vulnerable, less like the controlled businessman, and more like someone who'd been caught off guard by circumstance. The generators? He asked, shaking water from his jacket. Working, but barely. I think the storm's worse than they're designed for. He nodded, running a hand through his wet hair. My flight was delayed twice, then finally canceled. The drive from the airport was... He trailed off, seeming to notice her for the first time since arriving. Are you okay? I know you don't like storms. Ellery blinked. How do you know that? You mentioned it during one of our practice sessions. He paused. When we were discussing childhood fears. She didn't remember telling him that, but the fact that he'd remembered, that he'd thought to ask, created an unexpected warmth in her chest. I'm fine. Just a little jumpy with all the thunder. As if summoned by her words, lightning flashed outside, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the entire house. The emergency lights flickered, dimmed, and then went out completely. Total darkness. Well, Cassian's voice came from somewhere to her left. That's not ideal. Ellery fumbled for her phone's flashlight, the small beam creating a circle of pale light in the vast blackness. There should be candles somewhere. Miranda mentioned emergency supplies. Kitchen pantry. Top shelf. They made their way carefully through the house, her small light leading the way. The familiar spaces felt different in the darkness. More intimate. less formal. Without the usual lighting to showcase every expensive detail, it almost felt like a normal home where normal people might live. The candles were exactly where Cassian had said they'd be. Within minutes, they'd created small pools of warm light throughout the main living area. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, transforming the sterile perfection into something almost cozy. "I should change," Cassian said, looking down at his soaked clothes, "before I catch pneumonia." "Good idea. I'll see if I can find something for dinner that doesn't require electricity." When he returned 20 minutes later, Ellery barely recognized him. Gone was the business suit, replaced by dark jeans and a simple gray sweater. His hair was dry now, slightly tousled, and without his usual armor of formal clothing, he looked like an entirely different person. "You look," she started, then stopped herself. "Human?" he suggested, with what might have been self-deprecation. "I was going to say comfortable." She'd managed to assemble a meal of sorts: bread, cheese, fruit, wine that probably cost more than her old monthly rent. They ate by candlelight at the kitchen island, the storm continuing its assault outside. "This is nice," Ellery said, surprised to realize she meant it. "Power outages?" "No, just talking, without an agenda or a performance review." Cassian was quiet for a moment, swirling wine in his glass. "I'm not very good at that." "At what?" "Just talking, without purpose." He looked up at her, his face half in shadow. "My father used to say that conversation without objective was just noise. That's a lonely way to live." "It's an efficient way to live." But there was no conviction in his voice. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Ellery saw something in his expression: a vulnerability, a loneliness that mirrored her own. When the darkness returned, the space between them seemed smaller, charged with something more than the storm's electricity. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. "What?" "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met differently? Under normal circumstances?" The question hung in the candlelit air between them. Cassian set down his wine glass, his fingers drumming against the granite countertop. "Normal circumstances don't exist for me," he said finally. "Everyone wants something. Money, connections, access. No one just wants—" "What?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt her breath catch. "Company. Someone to talk to when the power goes out." The admission was quiet, almost lost in the storm's noise, but it hit Ellery like lightning. This wasn't the controlled businessman or the practiced husband. This was just Cassian, sitting in his dark kitchen, admitting to loneliness. Without thinking, she reached across the island and covered his hand with hers. His skin was warm, solid, real. "You have that now," she said, "even if it's temporary." His fingers turned over, palm meeting palm, and they sat like that in the flickering candlelight. Two people who had started as strangers in a business arrangement, discovering that the space between performance and truth wasn't as vast as they'd thought. And when he leaned closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, Ellery realized that some boundaries were meant to be crossed. The most dangerous promises are the ones whispered in darkness. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, questioning, as if Cassian was giving her permission to pull away. But Ellery didn't want to pull away. She wanted to lean into this moment, into the warmth of his lips and the way his hand cupped her face, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. When they finally separated, the candles had burned lower, casting longer shadows across the kitchen. The storm outside seemed quieter now, or maybe she was just too focused on the man in front of her to notice the thunder. "We should talk about this," Cassian said, his voice rougher than usual. "Should we?" Ellery's heart was still racing, her lips still tingling from the contact. "What would we say? That this complicates things? That we have rules, boundaries, made to be broken?" She surprised herself with her boldness, but the darkness made her brave. "Cassian, we're married. Legally, officially married. Is it really so wrong to want something real between us?" He stood up from his bar stool, pacing to the window where rain still streaked down the glass. In the candlelight, his profile was sharp, beautiful, tormented. "You don't understand," he said quietly. I don't do relationships, real ones. The last woman I tried to be genuine with sold our private conversations to tabloids. Before that, it was a corporate spy trying to steal trade secrets. Before that, I'm not them. No." He turned back to her, his eyes intense in the flickering light. "You're worse." The word stung, but before she could respond, he continued, "You're worse because I want to believe you. Because when you look at me like that, I forget that this is temporary, that in 4 months you'll walk away with your settlement and I'll go back to my perfectly controlled, perfectly empty life. Ellery slipped off her stool and crossed to him, stopping just close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. What if I don't want to walk away? The question hung between them like a challenge. Cassian's jaw tightened, and she could see the war playing out in his expression. Want versus logic, hope versus experience. Don't say things you don't mean, he warned. I mean it. The truth of it surprised her. When had her feelings shifted from tolerance to genuine affection? When had she stopped seeing him as a convenient solution to her problems and started seeing him as him? I mean it, Cassian. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face for a split second, and in that moment she saw everything he was trying to hide. Longing, fear, the desperate hope of someone who'd been alone for too long. Ellery. Her name was a prayer on his lips. This time, she was the one who kissed him. This kiss was different from the first. Deeper, more urgent, full of all the words they couldn't say. His arms came around her, pulling her against him, and she could feel his resolve crumbling like walls finally giving way to floodwaters. This is insane, he murmured against her lips. Completely, she agreed, not caring. They made their way upstairs by candlelight, pausing on the landing to kiss again, against the wall by her bedroom door, urgent and desperate like teenagers sneaking around after curfew. When they reached his room, neutral territory, somehow safer than hers, he set the candle on the nightstand and turned to face her. Are you sure? He asked, and the vulnerability in his voice made her chest ache. Instead of answering with words, she reached for the hem of her sweater and pulled it over her head. His breath caught, his eyes darkening as he took in the sight of her in the candlelight. What followed was tender, passionate, nothing like the cold transaction their marriage had started as. In the flickering shadows of his bedroom, they discovered each other slowly, carefully, as if they had all the time in the world instead of just one storm-darkened night. Afterward, they lay tangled in his sheets, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat return to normal. The storm had finally passed, leaving only the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Ellery, Cassian said softly, his fingers threading through her hair. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, barely audible, he whispered the words that would change everything. I love you. Her breath caught. Cassian, I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other, that this started as a business arrangement, but somewhere between the practice sessions and tonight He took a shaky breath. I've never felt this way about anyone. Never wanted someone to stay forever. Tears prickled at her eyes. I love you too. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating and completely inevitable. She lifted her head to look at him, seeing her own wonder reflected in his face. What does this mean? She asked. For us, for the contract? Forget the contract. His hand cupped her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I want this to be real. All of it. I want you to be my wife, not just on paper. Are you sure? Really sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. He pulled her up for another kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise. We'll figure out the details later. Right now, I just want to hold you. She settled back against his chest, feeling his arms tighten around her protectively. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to creep across the sky, but neither of them wanted to acknowledge that their perfect, storm-created bubble was about to burst. Promise me something, Ellery whispered. Anything. Promise me that when we wake up, you won't regret this. That you won't go back to being the cold businessman who treats me like an employee. Cassian's arms tightened around her. I promise. No going back. But as she drifted off to sleep in his arms, Ellery couldn't shake the feeling that some promises were easier to make in darkness than to keep in the light of day. Some silences are louder than screams. Ellery woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of running water. For a moment, she was disoriented. The sheets smelled like expensive cologne and cedar, and the mattress beneath her was firmer than her own. Then the memories of the night before came flooding back. The storm, the candlelight, Cassian's whispered confessions of love. She smiled, stretching languidly in his bed, her body still humming with the memory of his touch. The shower was running in the ensuite bathroom. He was awake, getting ready for his day. Maybe they could have breakfast together, talk about what came next, figure out how to navigate their new reality. The water stopped. Ellery sat up, pulling the sheet around herself, suddenly self-conscious about being naked in his space in the bright light of morning. Last night had felt inevitable, perfect, but now she wondered if she looked as disheveled as she felt. "Good morning," she said when Cassian emerged from the bathroom, already dressed in one of his perfectly pressed suits, his hair styled with mathematical precision. He paused in adjusting his tie, his eyes meeting hers briefly before sliding away. "Good morning." Something in his tone made her stomach clench. Gone was the tender, vulnerable man who had held her through the night. This was the Cassian from their first meeting. Professional, distant, unreadable. "Is everything okay?" she asked carefully. "Fine." He moved to his dresser, selecting cufflinks with the same methodical attention he gave everything else. "I have an early meeting. There are fresh towels in the guest bathroom if you want a shower." The guest bathroom. Not his bathroom. Not the bathroom they could share now that things had changed between them. Ellery felt the first flutter of panic in her chest. "Cassian, can we talk about last night?" "What about it?" His tone was so neutral, so businesslike, that she wondered if she'd imagined everything. The storm, the kisses, the whispered declarations of love, had any of it been real? About what we said, what we promised each other. Cassian's hands stilled on his cufflinks for just a moment before resuming their precise movements. "We said a lot of things. It was late. We'd been drinking. We hadn't been drinking that much." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "And you know exactly what you said to me." He turned to face her then, and she saw it. A flash of the man from last night, vulnerable and raw, before his mask slipped back into place. "I said things that were inappropriate given our arrangement," he said carefully. "I let the situation get out of hand." "Our arrangement?" Ellery pulled the sheet tighter around herself, feeling exposed in more ways than one. "Is that what you're calling it now?" "It's what it's always been." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was lying, that this was just fear talking. But his expression remained perfectly controlled, perfectly blank. "So last night meant nothing to you?" A muscle in his jaw twitched, the only sign that her question had any effect. "Last night was a mistake, one that can't happen again if we're going to maintain professional boundaries." Professional boundaries. As if they were colleagues, not husband and wife. As if he hadn't whispered that he loved her, that he wanted her to stay forever. "I see." Ellery's voice was steady, but inside she felt something breaking apart. "And the things you said? About forgetting the contract? Wanting this to be real?" "I was caught up in the moment." He finished with his cufflinks and reached for his watch. "It won't happen again." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Ellery watched him get ready for work with the same efficiency he brought to everything else, as if the night they'd shared was just another task to be completed and filed away. "I should go," she said quietly. "Good idea. Miranda will be here at 9 to go over the Napa Valley preparations. The board retreat is this weekend." Right. The performance they still had to give, the role of loving wife she still had to play. How was she supposed to pretend to be in love with a man who was pretending their actual intimacy had never happened? Ellery gathered her clothes from where they'd been scattered across his bedroom floor, each piece of fabric a reminder of how eagerly she'd shed her defenses the night before. She dressed quickly, aware of his eyes on her but unable to read his expression. At the door, she paused. "Cassian?" "Yes?" "When you figure out why you're so afraid of being happy, let me know. I'll be in my wing, maintaining professional boundaries." She saw him flinch at her words, but he didn't call her back as she walked away. Back in her own room, Ellery sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her reflection in the mirror across the room. Her lips were still slightly swollen from his kisses, her hair mussed from sleep and passion. She looked like a woman who had been thoroughly loved, but the man who had loved her was already pretending it never happened. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mackenzie. "How's married life? You looked so happy the other night. I'm so glad you found someone who gets you." Ellery stared at the message until the words blurred. How could she explain that the happiness her sister had seen was real, but the man who had inspired it was determined to bury it under layers of professional courtesy and emotional distance? She started to type a response, then deleted it, then started again. "It's complicated," she finally sent back. "The best relationships usually are," Mackenzie replied immediately. "Don't overthink it, Ellie. Just be happy. If only it were that simple." Through her bedroom window, she could see Cassian's Tesla pulling out of the driveway. He didn't look up at her window, didn't acknowledge her existence at all, just drove away like any other morning, leaving her alone in the beautiful empty house. Ellery pulled out her laptop and opened the document containing their original contract. 6 months, it said. 4 more months of this charade, of pretending to love someone who was apparently capable of turning his feelings on and off like a light switch. She'd thought last night had changed everything. Instead, it had revealed exactly how little she actually meant to him, and for the first time since accepting his proposal, she began to wonder if some contracts were meant to be broken. The hardest role to play is loving someone who refuses to love you back. The vineyard in Napa Valley was everything Ellery had expected from a billionaire's corporate retreat. Rolling hills dotted with perfectly manicured grapevines, a luxury resort that looked like it had been plucked from a magazine, and the kind of people who wore casual clothes that cost more than most people's rent. She stood on the terrace of their suite, watching the sun set over the valley, wearing a cocktail dress that Miranda had selected, deep emerald silk that brought out her eyes and clung to her figure in all the right places. She looked the part of a billionaire's wife, even if she felt like a fraud. "Ready?" Cassian appeared in the doorway behind her, immaculate in a navy blazer and slacks. He'd barely spoken to her during the 2-hour drive from Portland, maintaining the polite, distant facade he'd perfected over the past 3 days. "As I'll ever be." She turned to face him, noting how his eyes swept over her appearance with clinical assessment rather than appreciation. "Do I pass inspection?" "You look appropriate," he said, the same phrase he'd used at their wedding. It stung just as much now as it had then. The cocktail reception was in full swing by the time they arrived. Cassian's board members and their spouses mingled on the resort's main terrace, wine glasses catching the last rays of sunlight. Ellery recognized some faces from newspaper articles and corporate websites, titans of industry who controlled billions in assets and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Cassian," a distinguished man with silver hair approached them, arms outstretched. "And this must be the famous Martha we've heard so much about." Martha. Right. She was Martha Holt tonight, the loving wife with a carefully constructed background that existed only on paper. "David, wonderful to see you." Cassian's transformation was instantaneous. Warm smile, firm handshake, the picture of professional charm. His hand found the small of her back, a gesture that looked intimate but felt purely performative. "Martha, I'd like you to meet David Wellington, our board chairman." "David, my wife." "Enchanted," David said, kissing her hand with old-world courtesy. "Cassian's been keeping you quite the secret. We were beginning to think he was married to the company." Ellery forced a laugh. "Well, someone has to compete with Holt Digital for his attention. And how's that working out for you?" She glanced at Cassian, noting the tension around his eyes despite his easy smile. "It's a constant negotiation," she said truthfully, "but worth every battle." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in performance art. Cassian played the devoted husband flawlessly. His hand never left her back or waist. He laughed at her small jokes. He even told their fabricated coffee-spilling meet-cute story with convincing fondness. To any observer, they were the picture of marital bliss, but Ellery could feel the distance in every touch, the calculation behind every gesture. His fingers never lingered. His smiles never reached his eyes when he looked at her, and when she laughed at something genuinely funny, she caught him studying her with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. "You two are adorable," gushed Patricia Blackwell, the wife of another board member. "How long have you been married?" 6 weeks, Cassian answered smoothly. "Still in the honeymoon phase." "Oh, how romantic. And where did you honeymoon?" Ellery's mind went blank. They hadn't discussed this detail in their preparation sessions. "We stayed home," Cassian interrupted smoothly. "Martha's been working on launching her own design consultancy, and I had the quarterly reports to review. We decided to save the big trip for our anniversary. It was a perfect save, the kind of quick thinking that made him a successful businessman. But the ease with which he lied, the way he could fabricate intimate details about their relationship without missing a beat, made Ellery's chest tighten. "How practical," Patricia said with a slight frown, clearly expecting something more romantic. "We're very practical people," Ellery managed, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. As the evening wore on, the performance became increasingly difficult to maintain. Every brush of Cassian's fingers against her skin, every whispered comment meant for show, reminded her of that night during the storm when his touches had been real, urgent, desperate. The contrast was torture. "Excuse me," she said during a lull in conversation. "I need to freshen up." The ladies' room was a refuge of marble and soft lighting. Ellery stared at her reflection, trying to reconcile the elegant woman in the mirror with the confused, heartbroken person she felt like inside. Her lipstick was still perfect, her smile firmly in place, but her eyes looked tired. "There you are." Patricia Blackwell entered, checking her own reflection with the kind of casual vanity that came from decades of wealth. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you seem a little tense tonight." Ellery's stomach clenched. "I'm fine. Just a long day." "Marriage is an adjustment," Patricia continued, applying fresh lipstick with practiced strokes, "especially to someone like Cassian. He's brilliant, of course, but he can be intense." "What do you mean?" Patricia's eyes met hers in the mirror. "Just that he's not an easy man to love. Very guarded, very controlled. His last relationship ended rather badly, you know. The woman went to the press, made quite a spectacle. I think it changed him." Ellery's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "He mentioned something about that." "Did he tell you what she said? About how he could turn his emotions on and off like a switch? How she never knew which version of him she'd wake up to?" Patricia capped her lipstick and turned to face Ellery directly. "I'm sure it's different with you, of course. You seem to bring out a softer side in him." If only she knew, Ellery thought. If only anyone knew that the soft side Patricia glimpsed was exactly what Cassian was determined to suppress. "We should get back," Ellery said, not trusting herself to say more. "Of course, dear, but Ellery," Patricia caught her arm gently. "That is your real name, isn't it? Not Martha?" The blood drained from Ellery's face. "I don't know what you mean." "I make it my business to know things," Patricia said kindly. "And I know that whatever arrangement brought you and Cassian together, you care about him. It's written all over your face." Ellery's carefully constructed facade crumbled. "Does everyone know?" "Suspect? Some of us. But we also see the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Like you're something precious he's afraid to hold too tightly." Patricia squeezed her arm. "Give him time, dear. Some men take longer to admit they're in love." Back on the terrace, Ellery found Cassian deep in conversation with several board members about quarterly projections and market expansion. When he saw her approach, he automatically extended his arm, and she slipped into place beside him like a well-rehearsed dance partner. "Everything all right?" he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. For a moment she almost believed he was genuinely concerned, almost let herself hope that Patricia was right, that beneath his controlled exterior he was fighting feelings he was afraid to acknowledge. "Perfect," she lied, the word catching in her throat. The evening dragged on. More wine, more forced laughter, more touches that meant nothing to him and everything to her. By the time they finally escaped to their suite, Ellery felt emotionally wrung out. "That went well," Cassian said, loosening his tie. David seemed impressed. "I think the stable family man image is working." Stable family man image. As if that's all she was. A prop in his corporate theater. "I'm tired," she said quietly. "I'm going to bed." "Ellery." He caught her arm as she passed. For a moment his mask slipped, and she saw something raw in his expression. "Thank you. For tonight. For all of this." She looked down at his hand on her arm, remembering when his touch had meant love instead of gratitude for services rendered. "Just doing my job," she said, pulling free of his grip. As she closed the bedroom door behind her, Ellery realized that pretending to love someone was nothing compared to the agony of loving someone who was only pretending to love you back. The bravest thing she ever did was walk away from someone who couldn't love her the way she deserved. Ellery woke before dawn in the Napa Valley suite, her body aching from a restless night of broken sleep and painful dreams. Through the gauzy curtains, she could see the vineyard stretching endlessly under a gray morning sky that matched her mood perfectly. Cassian was already awake, sitting in the chair by the window with his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard with mechanical precision. Even at 6 in the morning, even after the emotional marathon of last night's performance, he was working. Because that's what Cassian did. He buried himself in spreadsheets and profit margins when real life became too messy to control. "Morning," she said softly, not expecting much of a response. "Morning." He didn't look up from his screen. "The car will be here at 9 to take us back to Portland. I have a conference call at 11. Of course he did. Back to business. Back to the carefully structured life where emotions were inconvenient interruptions to be managed and contained. Ellery showered and dressed mechanically, choosing jeans and a sweater for the drive home. In the mirror, she looked like herself again. Not Martha Holt, the perfect billionaire's wife, but Ellery Dean, the woman who had foolishly believed that a business arrangement could become something real. The drive back to Portland was a study in polite distance. Cassian spent most of it on phone calls, discussing market projections and acquisition targets with various executives. When he wasn't talking business, he was reading emails, his attention completely absorbed by the glowing screen in his lap. Ellery stared out the window at the Oregon countryside rolling past, her mind churning with Patricia Blackwell's words from the night before. Some men take longer to admit they're in love. But what if Patricia was wrong? What if the man she'd glimpsed during the storm, vulnerable, tender, capable of deep feeling, was just another performance, as carefully crafted as his public persona? Back at the house, Cassian disappeared immediately into his office for the promised conference call. Ellery stood in the marble foyer, listening to the familiar silence that had become the soundtrack of her marriage. 4 more months of this. 4 more months of loving someone who had decided that one night of honesty was a mistake to be corrected. She climbed the stairs to her room. Not their room, never their room, despite that one perfect night, and sat on the edge of her bed. Her laptop was open on the desk, displaying the freelance project she'd been working on before their weekend away. The client was a small nonprofit in Seattle, designing materials for a literacy program. It wasn't glamorous or high-paying, but it was hers. It mattered in a way that playing dress-up in Cassian's world never would. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mackenzie. "How was the fancy vineyard weekend? Send pictures." Ellery stared at the message, then walked to her closet and pulled out her suitcase. She'd been living out of boxes for weeks, never quite unpacking completely, as if some part of her had known this was temporary. Now she began folding clothes with mechanical precision, each piece going into the bag like another small act of liberation. Her wedding ring caught the afternoon light as she worked, the beautiful platinum band with its perfect diamond that had never meant what she'd hoped it would. She twisted it off her finger and set it carefully on the nightstand. It looked small and lonely there, like a promise that had been broken before it was fully made. Downstairs she could hear Cassian's voice through his office door, discussing quarterly projections with the kind of passion he'd never shown when talking to her. The sound solidified her resolve. She sat down at her laptop and opened a new document, then began to type. "Cassian, you told me that night during the storm that you loved me. You said I wasn't part of your plan anymore. I was part of you. You promised things would be different, that you wouldn't go back to being the man who treated me like an employee. But promises made in darkness don't always survive the light of day. I understand why you're scared. Your ex-girlfriend betrayed your trust, sold your secrets, proved that vulnerability can be weaponized. But I'm not her. I never was. And punishing me for her sins doesn't protect your heart. It just breaks mine. I won't spend 4 more months watching you pretend that what happened between us was a mistake. I won't smile and play the perfect wife while you practice emotional amnesia. I deserve better than that. And somewhere, buried under all that fear and control, you know I'm right. The ring is on my nightstand. The contract is on your desk. I've honored my part of our agreement. I helped you save face with your board, played Martha Holt to perfection, gave you exactly what you paid for. But I won't sell my heart for any amount of money. I'm not disappearing because I don't love you. I'm leaving because I do, because loving you is destroying me, and I finally love myself enough to walk away. Maybe someday you'll realize that the best things in life aren't the ones you can control. Maybe you'll learn that love isn't a liability to be managed, but a gift to be treasured. When that day comes, if it comes, you know where to find me. Until then, I hope you find whatever it is you're really looking for. Just know that it was never me. Ellery." She printed the letter and folded it carefully, then placed it in an envelope along with the house key Miranda had given her weeks ago. Her suitcase was packed, her freelance work transferred to her personal laptop, her few possessions gathered into a manageable pile. The rideshare driver was polite and efficient, loading her bags without comment. As the car pulled away from the house in the West Hills, Ellery looked back once at the place that had been her home for 6 weeks, but had never felt like it belonged to her. Her phone was already ringing. Mackenzie, probably wondering about those vineyard pictures. But for the first time in months, Ellery didn't feel the familiar anxiety of disappointing someone she loved. She felt something else instead. Relief, sadness, and underneath it all, a quiet kind of strength. "Hey, Kenzie," she answered. "Ellie, how was the weekend? You sound different." Ellery smiled, watching Portland's familiar neighborhood slide past the car window. "I sound like myself again. What does that mean? Is everything okay?" "No," Ellery said honestly, "but it will be." She had enough savings now to start over properly, not just surviving from month to month, but building something real. She could rent a decent apartment, maybe even start the design consultancy she'd always dreamed of. She could stop pretending to be someone else's idea of perfect and start being authentically herself. It would hurt for a while, probably for a long while, but at least it would be honest hurt, clean hurt, the kind of pain that came from choosing yourself instead of accepting crumbs from someone who couldn't see your worth. As the car carried her toward downtown Portland and whatever came next, Ellery realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go of someone else and of the version of yourself that was willing to accept less than she deserved. 6 months later, love finds you twice if you're lucky, once to teach you what it is and once to show you what it should be. The cafe on Northwest 21st Avenue had become Ellery's second office over the past 4 months. Tucked between a vintage bookstore and a plant nursery, it was the kind of neighborhood gem that served perfect lattes and didn't mind if you occupied a corner table for hours with your laptop and scattered design sketches. She was reviewing mock-ups for a local theater company's season brochure when she felt someone watching her. The sensation was subtle but persistent, like a gentle pull at the edge of her consciousness. When she finally looked up, her heart nearly stopped. Cassian stood by the entrance, scanning the crowded cafe with the careful attention he brought to everything. He was thinner than she remembered, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. When his gaze found hers across the room, he went completely still. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cafe buzzed around them, conversations and coffee grinding and the soft jazz playing from speakers. But Ellery felt suspended in a bubble of silence, her pulse hammering against her ribs. He looked different, not just the physical changes, but something deeper. The rigid posture had softened, the perpetual tension in his shoulders had eased. He looked, she realized with surprise, like someone who had finally figured out how to breathe properly. After what felt like an eternity, he approached her table. "Hello, Ellery." "Hello." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "How did you find me?" "I didn't. Not intentionally." He gestured toward the counter. "I was meeting a client nearby, thought I'd grab coffee. I saw you and—" He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she remembered. "Can I sit, please?" She nodded toward the empty chair across from her, closing her laptop to give him her full attention. Up close, the changes were even more pronounced. His expensive suit had been replaced by dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He looked more human, more approachable, more like the man who had held her during that storm 6 months ago. "You look good," he said quietly. "Happy." "I am." It was true. The past 4 months had been challenging, building a client base, finding her rhythm as a truly independent designer, navigating the emotional aftermath of their marriage. But she'd discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "How are you?" "Different." He smiled, and it reached his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. "Better, I think, though it took me a while to get there." "What happened?" Cassian was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I read your letter. Really read it, not just once, but dozens of times. And I realized you were right about everything." He looked up at her then, and she saw the vulnerability she'd glimpsed that night during the storm. But now it wasn't hidden behind walls of fear and control. "I was scared," he continued. "Terrified, actually. Of being hurt again. Of letting someone see who I really was underneath all the business suits and corporate success. So I convinced myself that what we had was just physical attraction, that the feelings would fade if I ignored them long enough. Did they? No. They got stronger. Every morning I woke up expecting to feel relief that you were gone, and instead I felt empty, like you'd taken something essential with you when you left." Ellery's chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "So why didn't you come after me sooner?" "Because I needed to figure out who I was without the fear first. I couldn't ask you to love a man who was still running from himself." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes intense but no longer cold. "I've been in therapy for the past 3 months, learning how to actually feel things instead of just managing them, learning that vulnerability isn't weakness." The admission surprised her. Cassian Holt, control freak extraordinaire, voluntarily exploring his emotions with a stranger. It was perhaps the most un-Cassian thing she could imagine. That must have been difficult. "Harder than any business deal I've ever negotiated." He almost smiled. "But worth it. Because I finally understand what you were trying to tell me that night. Love isn't something you can contract or control or contain. It's something you surrender to." "And have you?" "Surrendered?" "Completely." The word was barely a whisper. "I love you, Ellery. Not because it's convenient or logical or good for my image. I love you because you challenge me to be better. Because you see through all my walls, because you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. The words hung between them, honest and raw, and everything she'd wanted to hear 6 months ago. But she was different now, too. Stronger, more sure of her own worth. What would you want from me? She asked carefully. If I gave you another chance? Everything. Marriage for real this time. Not a business arrangement. A partnership where we both show up completely. Messy emotions and all. He reached across the table, his fingers barely brushing hers. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to fight with you and make up with you and build something real together. That's a big ask. I know. And I know I don't deserve it after how I treated you. But I'm hoping, he took a shaky breath, I'm hoping that maybe you believe people can change. That maybe love gets second chances. Ellery studied his face, looking for any trace of the cold, controlled man she'd married. But all she saw was sincerity, hope, and a love so raw it made her chest ache. I'd need time, she said finally, to trust that this version of you is real, to trust that you won't disappear again the moment things get difficult. I'll wait as long as you need. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm done running. She looked around the cafe, at her laptop, her sketches, the life she'd built piece by piece over the past 4 months. It was a good life, one she was proud of. But looking at Cassian now, seeing the man he'd become when he stopped being afraid of his own heart, she realized her life could be even better. Not because she needed him, but because they could choose each other freely, honestly, without contracts or conditions. Okay, she said softly. Okay, let's start over. Properly this time. She extended her hand across the table. Hi, I'm Ellery Dean. I'm a graphic designer. I'm terrible at parallel parking, and I believe in second chances. Cassian's smile was radiant as he took her hand. Cassian Holt. I'm a recovering workaholic. I make terrible coffee, and I just figured out that the best things in life can't be controlled. They can only be cherished. Nice to meet you, Cassian Holt. The pleasure's all mine, Ellery Dean. As they sat in that little cafe on Northwest 21st Avenue, talking and laughing like people falling in love for the first time, Ellery realized that some stories don't end when the contract expires. Sometimes they're just beginning. What would you have done in Ellery's position? Would you have given him a second chance, or would you have walked away for good? We all make mistakes in love. The question is whether we learn from them. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of love is having the courage to be vulnerable, and the greatest act of self-love is knowing your own worth. Your participation in the channel is very important. Please, leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.